Hello, everybody. This is our last lecture in archaeology. So let's get started. So, we're going to talk about complex societies in this particular lecture, and we're just going to talk about these definitions of what it is, and we're going to talk a little bit, or I'm going to end the lecture by talking about why the idea of a complex society is a little bit flawed. Okay. So a social some things that you a lot of this lecture is going to be actually like kind of like a checklist of things that if they qualify for these things, then they're probably economic societies. So the first thing is control of surplus production by a few individuals become evident, right? So if there is a group of people or a person that basically tells people what to do with the extra food they have, for example, then that would be a socially complex society. Okay. For those who don't already know, surplus production involves producing more food than bare minimum needed. So if we needed 30 fish to survive, there's like 50. Okay. Now, the second thing is more of an interesting point. Occupational specialization contributes to social stratification. It's a lot of crazy words. Don't want to break them down. Occupational specialization, occupation is just like your job. And specialization is, you're special at that job. So if you're talking about job specialties, that could be something like someone that's really, really dedicated or experienced in hunting, fishing, gathering, working clothing, working making weapons, making cookware, whatever it is, right? That's job specialization. So job specialization contributed to social stratification. Social stratification is when there are different categories in a society, and those different categories for people have different access to resources, right? So, for example, if you are in a society, the society I gave in the last lecture, kings, royal family, knights, merchants, peasants, right? The peasants have a different access to resources than the knights do, for example, right? And the knights have different access than the merchants do, so on and so forth. So social stratification is when different categories of people have different access to resources. In our society, in modern society, it is so different depending on where you are. If you are first, the first easiest thing is access to money, of course, but there's also access to different kinds of money. For example, I cannot work on AC units because of the HVAC example I gave last time. But also HVAC people cannot teach anthropology because they don't have an anthropology degree. Does that make sense? I did not either go to culinary school or spend 10 years in the kitchen, so I can't cook at this particular restaurant. Whatever, right? There's a lot of different ways in our society, but let's not focus on that. Okay. So, and again, occupational specialization is when individuals specialize in various occupational social roles, right? And the reason why it says occupation is because it's not only a job. If you are maybe a royal member of the, whatever family that's leading the group, then you could also consider yourself of a special occupation. Okay, great. So common societies have large populations, extensive division of labor, occupational specialization, and social stratification. So before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about classes, right? Classes are ranked groups within a hierarchically stratified complex society. Again, easiest example, king, queen, right? Royal family, or what's it called, nobles or whatever, knights, merchants, and then peasants, right? Those are different classes of people, right? They are defined primarily in terms of wealth, occupation, or other economic criteria, right? So either by the amount of money they have, the type of job or position they hold in the society, or anything that has to do with their economic something, right? For example, like knights aren't especially wealthy, but they do hold a special occupation. And because of that, they have different access to different resources. Okay. But let's go into this checklist for common societies, right? Large populations, pretty straightforward, a lot of people. Extensive division of labor and occupational specialization are kind of together. So division of labor means that they are dividing the work for the society in they have a lot of criteria, different types of criteria for what you need to do. So for example, you need to have, followed John Doe, who is our best fisherman, for 3 years before you become a fisherman, right? That is an example of extended division of labor. There's like a lot of criteria for what you need to do in order to be the fisherman for our society. Occupational specialization, we just talked about that, right? Job specialty. And finally, social stratification. We also just talked about that. Different categories in society that have different access to resources. Okay. Now, archaeological evidence for complex societies. How do we know as archaeologists that a society is complex? Well, there are a few signs, right? They leave traces in the archaeological record of monumental architecture, such as temples or pyramids, elaborate burials, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, artifact concentrations that indicate occupational specialization, and finally, regional settlement hierarchies at least 3 levels. So monumental architecture, everyone kind of gets that. It's just stuff that's hard to build. And if they built it, it means they probably had a complex society. This temples, pyramids, statues, freaking, bridges, whatever. There's a lot of stuff. Elaborate burials. So this goes 2 ways. Elaborate could mean physically, right? So like if you go into a pharaoh's tomb, there's a lot of jewelry there. There's like these very special coffins and stuff like that. But this could also mean ritualistically, right? So for example, for a lot of cultures, even in America, right, cremation or burying the dead is a pretty simple way to dispose of our past. However, there are things like wakes that are very complex. There might be a dance or ritual that's associated with burning the body or burying it that is, that would make that burial elaborate, right? So what I'm basically trying to say is for elaborate burials, it's not just physical, it could also be cultural, okay? The next thing, artifact concentrations that indicate occupational specialization. So if you find like, a sharp knife, a really round cup, specialized like fishing tools or something like that, right? These are basically indicating that there is a level of specialization in that society that allows them to make these things. Okay. And this is the last one. The last one's kind of hard to see, but it's, still a thing. Regional settlement hierarchies with at least 3 levels. So basically, if you can find evidence that there are at least 3 different kind of like classes, then that's a complex society, but that's pretty difficult to see. The obvious example that I can think of is if you dig up, a graveyard and you can tell that one of them is, one of them has a lot of fancy stuff in their coffin or whatever. One has, a few things, and the last one has nothing. Maybe you can indicate that there are 3, classes in that society, but the last one is pretty hard to see. Okay. So, explanations for the rise of common societies are similar to those explained in domestication. So basically, we're going to talk about like why societies became complex, and a lot of them are very similar to the explanations for domestication. Prime movers or single factors have been developed to explain the rise of complex societies. They're sometimes seen as applying to the rise of all complex societies across the globe. So these are the prime movers, okay? And it's problematic, but we'll go into that in the next slide. Domestication supposedly gave you a free time to invent complex social rules. Basically, because we were domesticating, we had more food, and because we had more food, we were able to focus on making rules instead of focusing on how to survive. Irrigation needs in dry areas that required a complex bureaucracy to develop and manage complex canal systems. So, for those who don't know, irrigation is the process of getting water from one place to another. In places where they are kind of far away from water, they needed to find ways to get water to them, and then they got it to them. But in order to do that, in order to develop basically a way to get water over to the society, what they're saying is that the water needs force people to be bureaucratic, meaning like kind of political, develop relationships, all these other things that may have led to complex societies. Population pressure, this one's pretty obvious. Growing populations that led to the rise of leaders to manage populations. So because there's so many people, they needed people to manage them, and that's how that came about, right? You have leaders. And finally, social conflict within societies, right? Social conflict is very obvious. If I spent, all my life trying to grow these tomatoes and someone just came in and stepped on my tomatoes, I'll probably stab them in the eye. that's not the right way to do things. If everyone does that, then the whole society is going to be chaos. So social conflict probably was another prime mover. Okay. The problem with these examples, though, is that they are unicausal or single cause factors, right? Meaning that this is only one thing. And if you think about again, or if you reflect on decisions we make as a people and even in our own lives, we don't decide on one thing. One thing is not really going to push us to any decision. It's multiple things, and that's where Robert Canero's theory comes in, right? Robert Canero's theory is multi-causal and consists of environmental circumscription. This refers to the lack of new lands for people to cultivate. Population pressure, which is similar to what we talked about earlier, which is causing stress on the lands available for cultivation. And finally, warfare, which arose as conflict between neighboring villages increased, right? When operating together, these factors led to the rise of the state. In Robert Canero's theory, basically, he thinks that it's these 3 or 4 things that happen all at once, which makes more sense because, again, it's never just one thing, especially when we're talking about all like human society. It can never just be one thing. So his theory is that it's a few things happening all at once. No single factor explains the rise of all early complex societies. Written records can provide clues, but are not found in all early complex societies. Early complex societies were unstable. Periods of political unity alternate with those lacking political integration. This can complicate our understanding of complex societies. So, so what is interesting about this one is like, written records are not always a thing, right? And there's going to be an example at the end that talks about that. Um, and, you know, there are a lot of opportunities for complex societies to fall. I don't know if you guys have watched Walking Dead, but there are quite a few societies that The Walking Dead, the main characters kind of came across. They were doing pretty good, but then they fell apart, right? Obviously, it was drama and conflict and stuff like that. But, in general, though, in general, a lot of things were like that. Things seem like they're going well, but then maybe something just didn't work out, and then everyone dies for whatever reason. Maybe everyone got sick, lack of food, whatever. But this does make it a little complicated for us, right? Because it's unstable. They could have just like had a sick turnout for their farming, but then all of a sudden, the dude that is responsible for teaching farmers how to farm, passes away, and then the whole society is now like kind of in shambles. Or it could be like more political things, like, I don't like the way you're being a leader. And even though the person might be a good leader, because I'm the one that, hunts or that produces like the corn for the society, they have to listen to me. And then there's conflict and then they fall apart, right? So ultimately, though, reason why this is important is this can complicate our understanding of complex societies because, again, just because we can't find it does not mean it didn't exist. And it's very confusing because we do not know how long they were complex for. They could have been there for years. We don't know. But because of the instability of complex societies, it's hit and miss. So here are some examples of complex societies that are kind of like a little more diverse in terms of their in terms of the criteria that they check off, right? So again, remember how I said earlier, right? We're going to talk about some things that maybe don't fit exactly into what we're talking about. So, um, early foragers along South America's Andean coast had monumental arts for irrigation and agriculture. The Inca Empire rose in the AD 1400s and was built on previous complex societies. They had monumental architecture, a split inheritance system, complex road network, and lacked writing. So this is very important, right? Because this is just to show that you can be a complex society without writing. Writing is not a criteria for being a complex society. While many complex societies do have writing, many of them do not. The empire fell in AD 1525 following the Spanish conquest and the English Civil War. So this is where it's very interesting. I don't know if you guys know this. So the Inca Empire is an empire. It's an empire. Like it's not just like one small place. It's massive, right? They were embroiled in the Civil War, right? They were basically fighting each other. And that was the only reason why the Spanish should come in and conquer them. If the Spanish decided to fight the Inca Empire on their own, they would have lost. So it was just a happenstance thing that they were having a civil war. Spanish came in at the right time, and then they ended up losing the war, right? But that being said, though, again, it is important to note that just because a society does not have writing does not mean that it's not complex. And in particular, the Inca Empire was a very complex society and it did not have writing. Very nice. So again, full circle, why is this idea of complex society flawed? It's not necessarily flawed. It's more about, you know, having these standards for what a complex society is always going to be changing. What is defined as complex is always going to be changing. And as we find more and more stuff, we're going to have different criteria for what complex actually is, right? What do we actually mean by complex? That's what's a little bit flawed, is that it's always changing. So you can't really pinpoint what is actually complex. That being said, though, what we have so far is what we have so far. So that's what we're going to be using. Okay. That was a short one. Good luck on the reflection. Should be pretty straightforward, so hopefully it's not too difficult. And as always, if you have any questions, please shoot me a email, and I'll be sure to answer. Yeah, I'll see you guys next week.